Well, hello and welcome to episode 141 of Retro Power Uncut. And we're going to start with me, surprisingly enough, in the fabrication workshop and have a little look at what we've been up to this week. Pretty much the usual, but we'll start with MK1 Escort. We're on the final bits of work on this. The very final stage will be to do the underside work. We're just buttoning up the last bits that really need to be done with it the right way up. So Sam and Tom have been working on this. Tom's full time. Sam has been doing some other work, work through in the assembly shop as well. But they're both working on it currently. And I'm going to hand over to Tom for a minute just to explain what they've been up to, really, because I think he can probably explain it just as well, if not better, than me. End of last week, start of this week, finished off all the metal finishing and planishing on the front wings, and then basically getting them realigned on the front of the car, getting all the gaps good, and then finalising the position of the inner reinforcers of the rear of the wings. Got them in, welded them in, and then just kind of moved on to all the prep work to getting all the full mock-up of the front end. Finished off the wings, did a few little bits and bobs on the front end to get that a bit better, and then me and Sam between us have been kind of like finalising everything before it all gets welded on, and then doing all the last little finishing off bits, so like brazing around the light apertures again. There was a little waver on this bit, kind of dipped in. So when me and Bobby put the rear screen in this morning with the rubbers, and noticed that everything's all right, gaps are all good. It's just this kind of panel where it's been welded in has pulled in a little bit. So split the corner, moved all this back up, re-weld the corner up, and then after that it's just full build up of the front end and start getting front panel welded on, slam panel welded on, and then get it on the spit and do all the underside stuff. So that's pretty much where we're at on Escort. There were only very minor little bits of fettling. And then the main work, as Tom said, is basically getting the front end all completely assembled, which it has been assembled. It's all been screwed together already. Everything was lined up. But obviously, every time you take it apart and put it back together again, it all changes. So somehow, I don't know how, some pixies walk in and move things. So it's being checked for the final time before the car is then taken off the two-post lift, put onto the rotisserie, and we'll do the seam brazing underneath, any other finishing welds that needed doing underneath. For example, the compression strut mounts, which are welded to the chassis rails on the front, which you would otherwise have to weld upside down. There's no point welding them upside down when you can weld them the right way, weld them in position with it on a rotisserie, just to make life easier. So that's going to be done on the rotisserie, and then at that point this is basically done. So all being well, with a bit of luck and a following wind and no disasters and all those things, end of next week we should be pretty much in the right position to be able to get it in the blast room, blast it, zinc metal spray it, and then start on the body prep process. So that's where we're at with Escort. Moving on from that, we're going to go past the Churchill Jaguar. Now, not a lot has changed on this for a couple of reasons. Stu's been away for several days and is in fact away currently. So not a lot has moved forward for a few days on this. However, things have been going on a little bit in the background, not great leaps forward, but things have been going on a bit in the background. And I mentioned, I think last week, if not then the week before, I lose track, about trying to do a bit of research about the extrusions that make up the upper door frames, the door window frames on Mark II Jaguars, which I suspect were also similarly used on a number of other Jags and various other things. Anyway, I've gone through all of the extrusions I can find on other vehicles that I know of that would be similar, and none of that are available second hand or anything like that. And none of them are really right to do the job. They're not right dimensionally. They seem to be fairly unique, the ones on the top of the Mark II Jag doors. So very helpfully, I've had a conversation with Simon Hill at Martin Roby Spares in Nuneaton, who we use a lot. And I'll sort of put my thanks in right now, in that Martin Roby's, specifically Simon Hill at Martin Roby's, have been incredibly helpful with the sourcing of parts that we need for these projects. And we're aware that not all of the work we do would be entirely endorsed by a typical Jaguar purist. So it's even more valuable to us that we have somebody as helpful as Simon has been with sourcing parts. And two items here really that are worth mentioning on video because they're quite interesting. He got back to me earlier with the information I was asking for about the upper door frames, which the answer is that basically they can't be of any help in terms of supplying those parts because he doesn't know where the tooling is and it may not even exist. However, he was able to tell me the twists and turns of what happened to the tooling, and probably the most interesting bit of the story of what happened to it is that those parts apparently were originally made by Pianoforte, which I didn't know, and it would kind of make sense. They were probably, I presume, presume this is the same piano. This is an assumption on my part, but I assume they're the same Pianoforte that made pianos. As such, they would have done quite a bit of brass work, and I presume that must have been the link. I don't know beyond that, but apparently Pianoforte originally made them. When the demand stopped and Pianoforte went, I don't know if they went bankrupt or the company was folded, I believe in the 1970s. I haven't done any research on this. This is done on very little research, so feel free to correct me. Don't call me an idiot. I'm just trying to do a bit of something that might be vaguely interesting. Pianoforte disappeared. The tooling was bought by Martin Roby. He went down and picked it all up, but because understandably in that period of 1970s and 80s there wasn't really any great demand for those parts. There isn't much demand for a Mark II Jaguar door frame now, let alone then. So that tooling wasn't really of much value, so he sold it. And it then jumped through a couple of companies that came and went and disappeared over the mists of time, and now nobody knows where it is. Or certainly the last company to own it went bankrupt and doesn't exist anymore, and who knows, it probably went in a scrap bin there. So the long and short is, I can't get an extrusion die. The die doesn't exist for the piece of brass extrusion that I need. So the long and short of it is, we're going to machine them. But I thought it was worth doing a few minutes. It hasn't taken hours. It's been maybe an hour in total of just messing around to just double check that somebody didn't just turn around and say to me after we've done it, oh, I've got the extrusion die for that sat in my shed in about 20 metres extrusion, which is always what happens when we jump into machining something. We get a comment on a video saying that somebody's got all the parts in the shed. The other part that Simon has helped us with is these. I think I mentioned that we were doing the trim mouldings. We needed to make the new trim mouldings, to the chrome trims that go down the quarter panels from the rear door on the normal Mark II Jaguar, obviously quarter panel on this, all the way down to near to the tail lights. Well, Martin Roby supply those parts, which are made from a brass mould. It's not an extrusion, I believe. I think it's a rolled part. But anyway, this brass part, they get these in, they shape them, and then have them chrome plated. So they have supplied us some of the raw brass moulding so that we can then shape those trim sections up, get them all finished. We'll shape up solid brass terminations for the ends of them to make them all look neat, get them all fitted, get them right, and then we'll get them in with all the other chrome work that we've got to do. On this car, stepping back from that, it's not actually chrome work, it's going to be copper, but that will all be undertaken by the platers that we always use now, which is Derby plating. So that's a nice move forwards in that these also at this length are not an easy part to get hold of either, and we've now solved that next little brass trim problem that we got on that. Interestingly, picking up a Q&A, I think Cal's going to do Q&A mainly at the end, but picking up one comment I saw on video, which was, why don't we machine the frames in copper? And it's an interesting point, considering we're going for an actual copper finish. There are a couple of complications. A, there's a few sort of refinements of the grades of copper, but also the strength is a bit limited. And yes, I think the comment made the point that the strength was requirement was fairly low on that frame. The problem is if we make it in copper, we've got to make the entire frame, everything, because joining becomes a bit more of a challenge. Yes, it can be welded, there's and it can be brazed. There's various other things, but really I don't want to be joining it to the remains of a brass frame. So it actually makes more sense to continue using brass and then copper plate it. It would always be copper plated prior to being nickel plated, and then having chrome plating applied over it anyway during the chrome plate process. It's just stopping that process a little bit sooner. So that's where we're at with that. Generally, when we want to chrome plate a part, we make it from brass if we can. It's the way it was done many years ago, but it still seems to be a way of getting a really refined surface at a not insane level of polishing cost, and have a material that's quite easy to work with at all stages. It's easily machined, it's easily brazed, it's easily joined, it's easily soldered, it's easily polished, on and on. It's really the right material for the job, other than it is quite costly. But also, going back to the copper, the other thing there is evident, copper's incredibly expensive as well. Wouldn't really save us any money making them in copper over making them in brass. Copper's actually, I don't actually know the metal prices at the minute, but I wouldn't be surprised if copper's actually slightly more expensive than brass. Moving on very briefly to the E-Type, the only real sort of move forward on this at the moment is that it has now been fitted to a trolley, and the body shop guys actually, because the work balance is meaning that the body shop are a little bit short on prep for paint until they get that Escort, so there's a slight gap which we'll come on to in a minute. But amongst that, they've been lending a hand, and they've made up the ends for this. So they've done a little, they've pulled in a bit of weight in the fabrication shop and just done a bit of a fairly simple fabrication on the ends of this trolley to make the trolley into a rotisserie trolley. I'm a bit nervous partly about suspending the E-Type just from its front and rear bulkhead areas while we remove floors and things. It's not without any central support. It's not the end of the world. I wouldn't be too concerned about it, but on an open top car, where we're removing a chunk of floor, it might be better to keep it more properly supported than that. But second to that, we are going to be replacing almost all of the rear of the car with composite. And at that point, we haven't got any means of attaching a rotisserie to the rear panel on the car. So the complication goes along. So we really needed to bypass all that part of the car and add an extension onto the trolley to turn it into a big rotisserie trolley, which is what we've done. There's method to the madness. Secondly, I've got a little prop leaning up, which is just tying into what I was saying again. Martin Roby's, we've just picked up this morning or yesterday a pair of full floor pans for this car. Again, dealing with Simon, very easy to deal with, very simple. Got the floor pans in stock, so they're now here, and that'll mean we can get on with the rust repair on this body tub, so we can get them moving forward in parallel with George doing the design work and CAD work for the composite parts. So that's where we're at on that. And then moving on to probably what really this week is really the meat in the sandwich, I suppose, which is the Allegro project Lucky Strike, which is forging ahead at quite a rate of knots. We've got Bobby and Scott working on this, and with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to them to talk about it for a bit.
So first off, we've been trying to get everything ready for fitting up the shell, including seals, scuttle, getting all of the scuttle welded to parts of the chassis, parts of the dash area. Then Bobby's been doing seal bits.
Yeah, the outer seals, what you can see, and then it was a couple of times taking off and on the body until we get them right, because we took off the body, put the seals on, with the body on, put the seals on so we can see our heights. Then took off the body, fully spot welded them, top, bottom, all of it, and then yesterday we dropped the body back on top, and now we mounted the doors as well, and we are trying to sort out the gaps with the doors. And it's a bit of a bummer because we discovered that actually the top hinge on the offside is being sheared off at some point. It's 10,000 mile car, and it's it had a 2 mil play in the hinge, so it was something wrong. And at the closer look, we discovered that actually it's sheared off. So we have to sort this problem out, and then we continue with sorting out the door gaps. and
Ready to just start welding everything on then.
and starting welding up everything, yeah, A-pillars, B-pillars, and then what Scott been doing with his front scuttle panel. What else Scott you been up to?
And then we basically just, once we knew everything was going to fit where it needed to, we then started epoxy and everything. So all of the inside of the scuttle, the sills, all of that's all been epoxied, ready to be welded on. And that's really been about it for this week. It's just a lot of test fitting and getting everything to fit where it needs to before final weld.
Yeah, actually, yeah, once it's all potted and welded up, we're going to have a rolling chassis.
So yeah, but they've pretty much summarised all the work going on. You know, to briefly sort of go back over it. The scuttle area is finished. It's sealed. It's primered. It's all ready to close in, so that it's got a pre-coating on everything, just in case there's any tiny bits in any corners that we can't get into. It's got a Celimix anti-corrosive epoxy primer in there, which is actually a marine. It's designed for marine applications. We've mentioned it before. I can't put it up. I'm not going to put it up on this video, but at some point we can actually give if you need to know exactly what it is, drop us a message. But at some point we will actually put the exact spec of what that is. But it's a Celimix anti-corrosive, very high zinc content epoxy primer. So we've used that in the scuttle area and then sealed it. The sills are fabricated. Again, that's Bobby and Scott have talked about that. Just to reiterate, they're a triple section sill. Originally, the Allegro was a 2-section sill, where it just had just a straightforward inner and then a big D section around the outside. We've changed that to be a stepped D section on the outside, and then a C section inside of that, and then a vertical section, just to add a bit more strength. Because the sills, compared to the Integra, are quite a lot smaller in actual overall cross section. They're no smaller than the Allegro ones, but they're quite a bit smaller than the Integra sills. Decided to add more material basically to get that strength back. So I'm quite confident this is going to be an awful lot stronger than the Allegro sills were, but probably not quite as strong as the Integra were. And then, yeah, moving on from that, literally as we speak now, the Allegro body shell is being prepared and welded to the Integra floor. By the end of today, most of the attachment work will probably be pretty much there. So yeah, the next step after that is get the front end on and a few more bits of fabrication inside the back, and we'll pull it off the jig, put it on its wheels and roll it round. And there we have a car that you can sit in, steer and roll around the workshop, which is pretty good going. So yeah, that's where we're at on Allegro Integra. And then just the final sort of summary is body shop, where, because we've got a bit of a pause in proceedings, we've got a slight infill project just to tide us over until the Escort's into the body prep area, which, as I say, hopefully week and a half away. Then tide us over until then. We've got a little side task coming through the works, which is a quick respray, in inverted commas, on a Peugeot 309 GTI, which affectionately termed as a scrapper by Mark. It's not too bad, as these things go. It's not too bad, but it's lived a bit of a life. So they're finding a few waves in some panels and a few bits that need attention. It's far from a quick blowover. But yeah, they're making progress on that, and we'll get that out of the way, and then hopefully Escort should be ready to come in and all will be well. So I think that's pretty much where we're at on this side, and I will hand over to Cal.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Nat. Unusually, we're going to start in the office because there's a variety of parts arriving now for a few projects, but specifically the Escort projects. And I thought I'd just talk through some of these bits. So the array of parts here are for the 2 MK1 Escort projects, and they basically revolve around the bonnet latching system and the door handles. So these parts and these parts are all bonnet latch related. And I thought I'd sort of talk through the reasoning. So on those Escorts, we're trying to tidy up the appearance of the slam panel area quite a lot, make it look a lot cleaner and nicer presented. But also, on the original Escort bonnet latch, it's basically just a hole in the slam panel, a spot welded piece with a little metal bar behind it, a spring that engages with the pin. And of course, when that metal piece on the bonnet comes down, it touches the slam panel and it's a painted part of the car. So you always end up with that area having paint scratched off it and getting a bit rusty. You can put grease on it, etc., but it doesn't look particularly tidy. And also with it being just a zinc plated mild steel part, the plating tends to come off, and it again doesn't look particularly pretty. So we decided to totally redesign all that area, and not only improve the cosmetics of the slam panel, but also mean that it's gonna last. So this is the bonnet latch assembly. top part is machined in aluminium. That's going to be hard anodized. And then the part on the bonnet pin that comes down is machined in acetal. So that's basically plastic on hard anodized aluminium there. And then inside, we've got a nylon two-piece housing, bottom part's in there. The actual latch part, which is in stainless steel, and then the pin, which is not here, but the pin that engages with that is going to be stainless as well. So the only two metal parts that contact each other are both stainless steel. And then underneath that, there's this piece which bolts onto the inside of here and basically encapsulates a little tension spring, which sits integral inside here with a shoulder bolt running all the way through this hole, right up through that assembly, keeps all that in check, keeps the end of the spring in check, and bolts into the underside of the top plate. So essentially everything's running in acetal, and the only metal parts that touch each other are stainless steel. And then the cosmetic parts are aluminium, and then the beauty of this is we're also going to laser etch this with information about the car. And then on the other side, symmetrically positioned, we've got the piece which will be where the bonnet safety catch comes down into. It's, again, two-part, sandwiches each side. This piece I think has an acetal part in it that when the hook comes down it rubs over. The hook itself is going to be a machined part, and then also this little plinth here allows us to have a laser etched image. So we're going to have our logo on here, Retro Power, on that bit, and that'll just really tidy up the appearance of the slam panel. But also, I mean, it's all going to last. There's nothing rubbing, no materials rubbing that are going to cause corrosion, etc. And that a part of that methodology goes over to the door handles as well. So we wanted to use early Mark 1 door handles on this, which look essentially the same as that. The later ones had a different shape to them, and the lock was mounted separately in the door. On these ones, the lock is actually in the button. In my opinion, the design of these is much more visually appealing. But the problem is, because the lock's in the button, all that does is prevent you from being able to press the button. When you lock the car, you literally can't press the button anymore. But there is no moving part internally that you could attach central locking actuator onto and unlock it from central locking. So what we decided, and also the early Mark 1 door latch mechanisms are not really as nicely designed, and the strikers for them aren't available new, whereas the latest type strikers are available new, and the whole latch mechanism is a bit more nicely designed. So we've actually done our doors to have the later type latch and striker with the early type handle on it, and then we've basically designed our own mechanism for these handles, which will actuate the later type latch mechanism. Now it's a two-part design, so you can't see all of it here because some of it's still being machined, but the back part that goes in here houses our own designed part that when you press the button it converts the motion into a crank externally, which actuates the lock, but also has a crank on it to connect to the central locking motor. So that's number one reason. Number two reason is the original handles are made out of some sort of monkey metal which doesn't get a very nice finish, and we wanted to do a bronze anodized finish on these. Don't really want a painted finish on an external part that's subject to wear. So that's reason number two, we're going to anodize them. And then the third reason is we wanted to have a way of stopping the push button from rubbing on the surrounding area, because if you look closely at most Mark 1 Escort door handles, because the button is literally just metal in metal, you get little scratches running down the side of the push button. So we've redesigned these to have little acetal bushes in there, so the actual button is isolated from the surround by that bush. And then also we've designed the push buttons to take an available modern lock barrel. So it's kind of the culmination of all those things. We can give them a nice anodized finish, the buttons aren't going to rub, we can use a modern lock that we can get brand new, and we can use the central locking and actuate the late type door latches. So that is that. The other thing I've got here is these instruments, which I've been working quite a bit recently with Dan Peterson at Peterson EV. I think the primary sort of purpose of his business is doing conversions of instruments for when classic cars are converted to electric. However, the sort of devices he's created to do that do have a lot of other features, and he's now geared up quite well for actually building bespoke instruments. So these are for our E-Type project, the 2+2, not the Roadster. Complete new build instruments, stepper motor drives. They're going to be, via this box, then controlled via the CAN communication from our engine ECU, which keeps everything nice and compact. And now, to be fair, on a Speedo and a Tacho, there's not that much, but when you extend that to all the auxiliary gauges, if you were doing that, it's a very nice way of doing it in that you can run just one set of sensors which are telling the engine ECU all the information, and then that transmits the data to the instruments or to this decoder via CAN, and then this can then tell traditional analog instruments what to display based on that, so you're not duplicating sensors. So very nicely made. Obviously we've got our logo on. We've changed the layout of the telltales because we were tidying up the layout of the dash, so the indicator telltales are on here, not on the dash. And then they've also got, although they've got fingerprints on now, but they've got this special anti-reflective coated glass which works remarkably well. You get very, very little reflection. When you first look at them, you actually wonder whether they've actually got any glass in. So very cool. Dan Peterson EV, great guy. Follow me this way. Briefly looking in there, we are just also organising a load of parts for the MK1 Escorts to go for Xylan and powder coat. So that's kind of the stage we're at, gearing up for the initial build phase on the first of the 2 MK1 Escort projects, where we're going to be getting it rolling. So we're just gearing up to get all that stuff out for plating at the moment. Right. Moving on from that, Morris, a few things on this. We had a load of anodising back last week. One of those things was the centre caps for these, so they are now going to Bruce Holder, who is going to do my laser engraving, and we're going to do the M logo that we did on the bulkhead pressed into it, lasered into the centre caps for that. And then James has been working on the handbrake, gator, surround and warning light switch arrangement, which is about done now. He's then handed over to Luke, who's just been designing a little billet bezel to finish that off, but we're at the point now where it's machine the bezel, do the gator, and that lot can go in. And then he's actually just moved on to a job which, it was, by my own admission, a bit of an afterthought job. We've got the battery nestled away under some panelling in the back there, and it's got a charge point there so you can trickle charge it and see the status of the battery. But it did dawn on us, after having put it all together, that we've got no way of isolating that battery in a hurry, so or disconnecting it at all if you want to work on the car without taking a load of the interior out. So as an afterthought, we've decided actually to put an isolator in there, so it's just modifying that cover panel over the battery to put a little isolator in. So if you wanted to disconnect the battery in a hurry for either maintenance or if there was some sort of emergency electrical situation going on, you can just kill the battery really quickly. So get that in, and that'll button that up. And I think actually we're really going down the last little bits and bobs of road testing and ready for handover on this now. So very exciting point to be at. And speaking of handover, you'll notice probably the Stratos isn't here anymore. So the Stratos has gone back to the owner. It's basically got to the point where we were happy for him to take it. He was back in the country for a week this week specifically. Although the car's not 100% a polished product, we've still got a little bit of mapping to do, specifically around cold start and idle control. The air conditioning's not been commissioned on it yet. There were still a few little cosmetic details to finish on it. It was just a great opportunity for him to actually come over. He doesn't get to the UK very much. Come over, use the car, get out on the road in it. So he's out in that, has been out in that a couple of times now. Sounds like he's having fun with it. And I think that'll be back either later this week or possibly next week when he flies back home. And then we're going to trickle through the remaining jobs on it at that point. But yeah, it's just great to be uniting owner with car and actually out on the road for the first time. So that's another exciting tick for this week. What else is going on? So Land Cruiser. Actually, I'll just sort of wander over here. It's amazing how much space there is in there. I'm sort of wandering around aimlessly because I'm not used to having this much space to choose from. But yeah, Land Cruiser, notable changes. The lashing points at the top of this side of the roof there, they were away being anodised, but that's a part that we've designed and implemented on there. Essentially, the owner wanted a way of potentially lashing ropes, or so he could string tarpaulins out off it for camping purposes, that sort of thing. So we've done some little brackets that bolted up there with pit pins in them, which is just a really nice, neat, sort of well-engineered solution to that. We did think about just doing loops, but then we thought, well, if it's ever got like a looped rope or something to go on there which can't be undone, it would be nice if you could actually just have a pin and put it through the loop. So that's that. What else have we been up to on that? I think Gibbo's actually in the process of spanner checking, which is always a good sign when you get to that point. And probably biggest buzz for me is seeing the seats in for the first time. So he finished off all the fuel tank panelling, got the seat runners in, got the seat frames in, and got the upholstered seat cushions in. So that's really brought the interior together. And it's just wonderful seeing it at that point. And there's just a couple of little bits left to do. We've got to put the shifter housing back on because we had temporarily wired the diff lock, and we're just doing the final wiring on that because we were doing it for testing purposes before with a button outside of the housing. And then I've got, there was an error on the wiring loom where the comms port for the ECU was probably about 2 inches too short to go in the port that's in the glove box. So we're rectifying that, and then that glove box insert with the comms port in it can go in, and that is literally the interior done then. We've just got to leather the column shroud as well. Yeah, it's just amazing seeing it all together now. We've got the number plates on, which is always a good sign, and as I say, spanner check being done. And then we've still got to tackle the squeak, which leads me onto an interesting email I had. I thought I would actually read this out because if somebody took the time to send it to me, I've had a few sort of comments about possible, just throwing ideas out, but this was an interesting one from a guy called Steve Jackson. He said, probably 20 years ago, I got involved in a similar squeak on a Lexus SC430 at a local main dealer, where I completed independent workshop audits for and on behalf of Lexus. The vehicle on memory was only or less than 12 months old, but had accident damage, and due to the damage, the decision was made to change the cam belt and the belts and cam belt, etc. The technician had complained about this squeak, and during his investigations, when I was on site, he had gone through all of the auxiliary belts and these had been removed so as to only running the cam belt, which is exactly the stage we're at on it. I was advised it's not uncommon for Lexus V8s cam belt idlers to squeak, and to identify this, white grease was sprayed onto the back of each idler to identify which one. It was also highlighted it was not uncommon for the lower front crank seal to squeak on early V8s, and the same diagnosis was to be applied. The tech with his master tech were completing some final checks prior to further strip down to gain access to the idlers when I was asked to take a listen and advise on what was going on. Both were not convinced it was idler squeak. After my ear had been around the engine, it was decided by all to run a yellow tyre crayon on the smooth face of the rotating cam belt. After applying a small amount of this, the squeak immediately stopped. On my return to the dealer a number of days later, after further investigation, the tech presented me with an idler, and as explained, at idle speed, the cam belt was slightly moving over and squeaking on an unpolished part of the belt running face. On his measuring, the polished running face was slightly smaller than the other idler. He claimed that was the cause of the squeak. I was informed that this was reported back to Lexus with video and photographic evidence. Looking at the running face of the idler, the outer edges were not finished polished. There was approximately 1 mil to 1.5 mil difference and a slight run out of the polished running face. Apparently the engineers reported back the squeak would have disappeared after running in miles. So that was a really interesting one because we were definitely homing in on it being potentially the belt. Now I thought, I'll just try that tyre crayon idea, and it didn't make it go away, but I'm still reasonably convinced it is one of those things. And it's interesting just hearing a story back from somebody who actually worked with Toyota, Lexus, back when they were almost a new car, kind of chasing similar things with very minor problems that could cause such an irritating feature. So we're going to carry on working through that and see where we get to. But again, actually that one with the Stratos out on the road at the minute, Morris is almost ready to drive. This, we've obviously got to do a mapping session on it, but then that's going to be ready to drive. And then Camaro. So Anthony's been on with a few bits on this. He's actually working right behind me at the moment on the grille. So I think I might have mentioned last week that we were looking at the grille and realising that the order of assembly, because we wanted to have some lower grills in the sort of lower valance area, was going to be quite tricky with the grill. And we came up with this plan to make some little aluminium channels that sit at the top and bottom, and you actually slide the grill meshes in afterwards. And that's what Anthony's on with at the moment. So we basically come up with a way of clamping those channels in with a strip the other side of the plastic grill frame, and there'll be slightly countersunk, I think M3 bolts that we're using, that are then tapped into the metal strips on the back of the plastic, so you can attach those in a nice fashion where the bolt heads don't interrupt the meshes as they slide in. And then the idea is those will sit in place on the grill. You'll slide one side of the mesh in, slide the other side of the mesh in, and then there'll be a little central rib which clicks in at the bottom and then bolts in at the top where you can't see the bolts to finish the central part, which will also have a badge on it. And that, as far as I can see, looks to be going pretty well. So I think it's just fettling the channels at the minute. They'll be black anodised when they're done. And that pretty much, once we've done the lower grills as well, that'll button up the appearance on the front of the car, which is a pretty exciting stage to be at. Luke, I think, has finished his designs for the bonnet pin bezels and the caps. So I think we talked before about the fact we're going to make our own caps for the power steering and the radiator fillers. They're such a prominent feature. And we've done a hidden pressure cap on the front panel, on the radiator, sorry, so that we could just do a normal threaded cap as the visible fill cap. So Luke's actually been designing the final caps for those now, because of the fact that they're positioned where they are on the slam panel, and then a similar position on the bonnet. We thought we'd do a design for both that tied together really closely, so the appearance of the bonnet pin bezel will be very similar to the appearance of the cap. And a bit like the Land Cruiser lashing points, we're using pit pins, so they just click in, little balls pop out the side to stop them coming out, so you don't have to have like an R-clip or a flip-over ring kind of rattling around on there. You just push the little button and it releases and you can pull them straight out. So that's looking good. And then Sam has been on with the seat subframe. That's kind of a knock-on effect from the centre console design. We've got so far with that console design, but then we wanted to see how wide or narrow the rear extension needed to be, and to do that we needed the final seats in the final positions. So Sam's been making up the seat subframes to mount the Recaro LXs in there that we're going to use, obviously reupholstered, not the ones that are literally in there, so that once they're mounted, which they now are, we can do a quick 3D scan. That'll give us that space that we need to finish off the rear part of that console design. So that's going really well. And then on the subject of scanning, I think Luke and Tarks earlier this week were scanning the front of the Allegro, kind of with obviously the front part of the Allegro bodywork is separate to the car at the minute. So they were scanning that with a view to designing the whole grille and headlight surround assembly, which Luke's been on with. It's going to be a sort of progressive process of design, but actually I'm pretty happy with where he's at cosmetically. We're just going to have to move on to 3D print prototyping some of that now, which I don't know if Nat will have mentioned or not, but we've had some trauma with the 3D printer, so hopefully that'll be resolved soon. And I have a feeling, looking at the list of things we've got to prototype, it'll be running solidly for about 3 or 4 weeks, I'd have thought. So that's that, and then I was just going to finish off, because I keep forgetting to do so. Oh, I've left my phone in the office. Bear with me. It was going so well until I forgot my phone, which I'd saved the questions on I was going to answer. So yeah, I neglected to answer any questions last week, so I thought I'd just rattle through a few this week. Going to start with TJ930. May I ask how tall the Stratos driver is? I'm just over 6'2". Handsome vehicle. Didn't look to be as accommodating as the average Porsche though, for example. Yes, it's probably best described as thoroughly cramped. I'm also 6'2". I do have quite an abnormally tall upper body, which always causes me headroom problems. But yeah, I mean, I am really tight in that car, kind of uncomfortably so, if I'm honest. So yes, if you are 6'2", I wouldn't advise having a Stratos. Very, very cool car though it is to look at, and that one is savagely quick to drive and incredibly go-kart-like. It is extremely cramped. Right, the wheel arches to wheel fitment on Stu's Jag look totally off, and generally the wheels look oversized for those arches. Are those the final wheels? This was interesting. 7906 was the user. No, they're not the final wheels. They are the closest thing we had to run the car around on, because we got them from the XJR donor car that we had earlier on in that project. So the rears at the moment look too narrow. We're going to have a wider offset on the back The fronts look too wide, although actually the final wheels will probably be about that offset, because one of the few remaining exterior metalwork jobs on that car is adding the flares to the front arches to match the rears. So basically, no, it's not those wheels. The diameter, I think, will be the same as that. I think we're going with 17s, but by the time we get the tyre sizes dialed in and the different style of wheel, I think you'll sort of come to terms with the fact that 17s on a Mark II can look surprisingly okay. If you look at Project Utah, that's also on 17-inch wheels, and it really doesn't look as out of kilter as you might think. When you encounter, this is Stuart Kenyon 1052, when you encounter painful problems like the Morris is having, who covers the expense for troubleshooting the client or retro power? Essentially, in 9 times out of 10, the client. You know, these cars are essentially prototypes that we're developing, and there will always be, there's not a manual for how to build this car. You know, there will always be troublesome tasks along the way, and we have to charge for that. Obviously, there are instances where we've obviously made a mistake with something, and you know, there's no doubt that the mistake was just stupidity on the part of us, and in those instances, obviously, we'll redo it, and you know, without any question whatsoever. But a lot of the things that we come up against are just development problems that I cannot point a finger at anyone here and say, well, you've done that completely stupidly, or how could you make such a mistake? And in those instances, it just has to be considered to be development of the car. Where do you see RetroPower in 10 years' time? Will you expand if the customers are there, or keep it the same size with regular customer work? Well, this is a question that's been on and off over the years. I said in the previous episode, we've got a very long waiting list, and of course, if we could have a lot more staff and get through the work more quickly, we would get through that waiting list quicker. So the work is there, but Nat and I have always had this nervousness about getting too big too quick, losing control of the quality, you know, losing the feel of it. You know, it's got a close-knit team feel about it, and I don't want to lose that. So at the moment, you know, we have expanded a lot. We've taken a lot more guys on. There's 20 of us now. I think 21 at the moment, but one's only a placement, but 20. And I think at the start of COVID, so 3 years ago, I think we were probably at 10 or thereabouts. So yes, we have expanded a fair amount. I think as it stands now, this is probably as many people as we can support in this building. Further to that, we don't have, and probably have never had, like a massive long-term goal. The business just started as Nat and I thinking maybe we could make a living mucking around with cars, and it pretty much is still that. So you know, the long-term goal for us is not necessarily financial, it's just wanting to meet cool people, build cool cars. Hopefully people will remember them in years to come and enjoy it. Last one, Dale 205 Mills. Is there any update on when you'll be starting work on the Peugeot 309 GTI that was shown a few months ago? Well, funnily enough, things have changed a little on that, and I ended up buying that car off the owner because he decided he wasn't going to go ahead with the project, and it's just been in storage on site ever since. However, there's a convenient slot in the body shop to sneak something in for paintwork at the minute. So you may have noticed it in the background, and it is currently getting a paint refresh, because that was probably the worst bit of it. And then we'll see. So I think you've probably spotted my Ready 30 over there under a cover. Maybe it's not been covered up in some of the episodes. That is extremely close to me being able to use that now. And in all honesty, it's been fairly close for a while, but it is literally, I need a new alternator and bolt the interior in, and I should be using that. And the intention is I'll probably put the 309 in its place, where it will no doubt languish for years with me not being able to actually find the time to do any work on it. But certainly the intention is that that will follow on as something for me to use, something front wheel drive. For me, the E30 is a really nice balanced screamer of a rear wheel drive car, lightweight, and the 309 is going to be the equivalent but front wheel drive. So yeah, it may be featured but not prominently because it's not a RetroPower project, it's my own now. So yeah, that's that, and I think on that note, we'll see you next week.